Welcome everybody to Mind Your Mind podcast. Here we are again with a new episode. My name is Roxana Parra Sepulveda. I am your host. And today we are with Fiona Dunkley. I have the pleasure to be with her. She brings a huge amount of knowledge and understanding. I want to tell you a little bit about her. She's a senior accredited BACP psychotherapist, trainer, mediator, and supervisor. She specializes in trauma care and has supported individuals all over the world, working with the NHS in forensic sexual assault unit. Alongside the Metropolitan Police, she experienced firsthand the impact of this work on staff well-being. She managed a team of trauma counsellors at Transport for London soon after the 7/7 terrorist attack and realized the need for organizations to become trauma-informed. She set up the Trauma and Crisis Unit at Interhealth, a charity supporting over 500 humanitarian and government organizations globally. The recognition of psychosocial support for the carers and protectors of our world led Fiona to set up FD Consultants, a global psychological health consultancy with over 50 therapists speaking over 30 languages. FD Consultants' clients organizations include the humanitarian sector, healthcare workers, emergency first responders, mental health charities, journalists, and content moderators. Burnout, post-traumatic stress disorder, and mental health struggles were abundantly prevalent, and Fiona sought to offer a solution to support the workers and offer guidance to organizations. Fiona has trained staff in critical incident response in Kenya, supported Syrian refugees based in Gaziantep, and offered trauma support in Myanmar. Through her work with FD Consultants, established in the UK and Europe, Fiona has also helped to set up psychological first aid peer support programs in Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, and Myanmar. Fiona is a publisher, author. She wrote a book called Psychosocial Support for Humanitarian Aid Workers, has presented on TV and radio, and speaks at international conferences as a mental health specialist. What a background. Fiona, welcome. Again, it's beautiful to have you here. I'm so looking forward for our conversation. Thank you for being here, first of all.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, and welcome to the listeners. The more we can have these conversations, the better, really. We want to normalize the trauma response. We want to help people be able to stabilize themselves and others, and know where to signpost for help, really. I'm a strong believer that everyone can recover from trauma with the right help, and hopefully my book will go some way in helping individuals and organizations in how best to take care of themselves and those that are impacted by trauma and traumatic events.
Absolutely. And I have been reading your book, and want to thank you for writing it. Your book is Psychosocial Support for Humanitarian Aid Workers. That's the name of your book, and right?
Yes, that's
right.
Yes,
yeah, okay, got it right. Fantastic.
Yeah, and support for humanitarian aid workers, the roadmap of trauma and critical incident care.
Yes, I knew it was something more about it. Yeah. And a very useful book, because it's talking about not only what happens in our brain and what the trauma response is about, but also bringing case studies. And I found that particularly useful, because we not always get to understand how the work of people that are in the front line in other sectors can be, no? Yeah. I have been working in the Vogue sector mostly, the violence against women and girls sector mostly, and working with refugees as well. And I keep thinking about this idea that probably different challenges, everybody that is working in the front line in different fields will have different challenges. But first of all, can you tell us a little bit about what motivated your book?
Yes, I will do. And just before that, I just said, I'm really appreciative to all the individuals that did share their stories in the book, and it makes it very rich to have those personal stories of how people struggled, but how they also reached post-traumatic growth. And we'll talk a bit more about that, I'm sure. So I'm actually a survivor of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder myself. I was attacked in my 20s. And through my work, I also experienced firsthand how police, medics, therapists, the criminal justice system can re-traumatize individuals if they're not, if they haven't been trained in trauma care. And one of our most popular trainings at FD Consultants is the trauma awareness workshop. But I love working with trauma because I do enjoy watching that process of healing that leads people to post-traumatic growth. So I suppose my own story of having had PTSD and then how I've wanted now to use my experiences to help others. And it was strange because I kept hearing this voice of saying reaching the masses. And then I just got this phone call from Rutledge out of the blue asking me to write a book on trauma care for the humanitarian sector. And even though actually the book can support anybody whose work exposes them to trauma or anyone who's been impacted by trauma, it's quite good that it's written specifically for that sector because there's very little written on psychosocial support. And so my aim is really to educate as many people as possible to become more informed, so that we don't re-traumatize individuals and people. And I'm a strong believer that people can recover, everybody can recover from PTSD with the right support in place.
Yes, it's so lovely to hear you, because definitely that's what brought us here together today. We are with the same mission in a way, no? And something that has motivated me as well to do the podcast is to go out to as many people as possible, to start to normalize the effect of working with survivors of trauma, the potential impact of secondary traumatization. And is something that I say all the time, is that we are human, no? And that our responses are completely natural in front of very abnormal circumstances that we are witnessing day in and day out. So yeah, is part of the work that bring us together. So thank you again for being here. What do you think are the main challenges that the humanitarian workers experience as part of their work?
Yeah, there's many.
For sure there are, yes.
I mean, through the research of the book and having spoken to hundreds of individuals who work in the humanitarian sector, I mean, one of the themes that came out was this kind of minimalizing our own self-care, sacrificing ourselves for the greater cause. It was a really common theme. Who am I to ask for support when others are suffering so much more than myself? And so often people don't reach out until they're really struggling. And the workloads are high. The type of work is very intensive. I think it's very hard to say no and put healthy boundaries in place, because the work is endless. If you want to change the world for the better, that work is endless.
It's non-stop, yeah.
Exactly. I often feel at the end of the day that there's so much more I could have done, and I just have to reframe that into focusing on what I have achieved. So people will give a lot of themselves. They often describe this as more than a job. It's a life purpose. So then there is that risk of overstepping the boundary, and work, can then fall into the personal time and personal life. There's the global context. So we're working over several time zones. So again, that can make us work over the remit or responsibility of our role. There's the exposure to traumatic material, whether directly or indirectly. So we see the darker side of life, and that is to impact us. We might feel more hypervigilant. There's more risk then of experiencing some of those trauma symptoms, or some people will go to the opposite end of the extreme and numb out, compartmentalize, shut down, and then we have the risk of compassion fatigue. There's lack of resource in the sector generally, lack of funding. There's always those funding pressures, lack of staff, having efficient time, and when an incident happens, there's that whole emergency response. Everything is very urgent, and that can lead then to possible burnout or moral injury. The other thing I find is there's a lot of organisational restructuring. It almost comes around every few years, and whether that's to do with the funding structures, but again, then people haven't got that kind of stable foundation because there's so much uncertainty you're having to manage. And then the other interesting aspect I'm always fascinated by is what leads people to do the jobs that they do. What history are they coming with? What experiences do they have in their past that lead them to do this type of work? And we know with trauma that, if we're exposed to a traumatic incident and someone comes to me for trauma therapy, it's going to possibly uncover other historical traumas that we're going to be working on. It's not always the presenting trauma or the presenting issue. So yes, lots of themes, lots of different challenges.
Lots of different challenges, but so many important points, because one of the things that I have observed that is, the scale of the problem, in the sense of when you are dealing with the suffering of others and realizing that dark side of the humanity, no? And I'm talking about dealing with working with people that are survivors of abuse, for example, or domestic violence in my case, all the work that the people in the rape crisis service does, and so on, no? But also we are confronted with other kind of situations, I think, with humanitarian people that are dealing with the aftermath of natural disasters, for example, no? And in that place, you also see a lot of good stuff, good things happening, no? But at the same time, you can see how that can also bring up the more negative aspects of the human being. So in front of the scale of the problem is such a natural thing, I think, not such a natural thing to think, I think, to go into that place of who am I, to ask for more. Look how much suffering is out there, and therefore that brings this reduction probably in enjoying life, in connecting with life, and how that disconnection then start to progressively be bigger and bigger and bigger, touching on our personal life, but also the connection that we have with our loved ones, for example, and how emotionally available we can be for them, how tolerant we can be with them, and so on, no? So there is so many aspects.
Yeah, it does. It brings out the best and the worst, absolutely, in humanity. And as you say, that there are people doing amazing work out there that are highly resilient, but it's normal to be impacted by the exposure
100%.
to the darker side of life. And yes, that's one of the struggles, is often when people come back from deployment or have been involved in a really intensive piece of work, how do you reintegrate? How do you find a sense of fun again? How do you have the more light-hearted conversations when you've been exposed to so much suffering? And that's a real challenge.
Absolutely. And because also is something that that I think is also difficult to share, no? How can you bring up those conversations of the things that you have been witnessing with your loved ones, for example, when they have been, having their day-to-day, natural day-to-day here, that is safe, is protected, and there is sort of a disconnection there too, no? And how to find those spaces where people can actually process the experiences they have had, and I think there is there also that element of overload into our brain, no, where we get to a point where we have seen and experienced and witnessed so much that then there is an overload, and that can lead also to these extreme responses that you were talking about, that take us into being in a more hypervigilant place, or hypovigilant, or hypo in terms of our responses, that will lead us to that numbing and that disconnection. There are other issues as well, no, that I think we are talking about two groups here that comes to mind. You tell me what you think. On the one hand, we have what is related to the individual, their personal responses, what they can do to maintain and rebuild resilience over and over again. But also there are more structural systemic problems that have to do with funding, for example, and that leads to, as you were saying, the restructuring within organizations and the lack of stability. We know that knowing that is a secure base to go back to is something very positive for our resilience, right? But also the elements of workload and how the work is organized, in the sense that allow people then to take breaks, to have a workload that is manageable, and that don't necessarily make them feel that they have to be working those extra hours over and over again. This is necessary sometimes, but not as a consistent practice, right? Fiona, there are so many different aspects to this situation. And I'm wondering, do you think guilt plays a role in how easy it is to open up about personal distress and needs? Or is this just in the humanitarian sector?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, guilt comes through so many times from individuals and groups. And one of the things we do at FD Consultants, we offer supervision, regular supervision for teams that are identified in high-risk roles. I remember working with this group, and I often say to people, imagine a guilt bin, and whenever you get those guilt thoughts, you throw that thought into the bin. And they actually took it one step further and created this bin in their office and labelled it guilt. And so they made a bit of humour about it. And every time they had this guilty thought, they'd write it down, screw it up on a bit of paper and throw it in the bin.
Fantastic. I love that.
But obviously, again, it comes into this, who am I to ask for support when all of this suffering is happening? And I often hear people say, you know, when they're watching or they're very involved in a project, it's very hard to stop, because one, there's that kind of adrenaline fueled addiction to watching trauma. We are drawn to watch what is a threat. It's hard to look away from. And so people have often said to me, I feel guilty if I stop working on this project, or if I literally take a 5-minute break, or if I'm watching something live unfold on the news, I feel guilty. I'm leaving these people in this distress. So we know that's the emotional brain taking over, and the rational brain is shutting down. And I've even found myself doing that. I was being interviewed on Radio Live 5 around the Grenfell Tower fire. And I felt like I had to watch everything, and I was saturating myself with all of this material. And I literally had to say to myself, turn that off, go for a walk. You know what you need to know. And so it can be hard to look away. And one of the TED Talks I refer to in our trauma training is that by Kat Carter on vicarious trauma. So she does work for Save the Children International, and she talks about suffering from vicarious trauma for 5 years, listening to stories of children all around the world and horrific experiences that they've had, takes its toll. And she said her biggest regret is that she didn't reach out for help earlier. And the thing that stopped her from doing that was guilt. Who am I to say I'm suffering when all of this is happening in the world? And then the vicarious trauma turned into PTSD, which we know it can if it's not dealt with. And then she reached out to have EMDR, movement desensitization reprocessing therapy, and she recovered enough to tell her story on the TED Talk. So guilt comes up a lot. I think in these sectors, in the work. Absolutely.
Yes, and guilt seems to be then a very big, important aspect that can be an obstacle for people to actually recognize to oneself. I think I have experienced that as well, that you are so immersed in the work and doing and focusing and going on and on and on, that to pause and recognize where are you at, it becomes something that not always happens, no, and not that easy to do, and to recognize to oneself, this is not exactly where I want to be, or this is a sign here, no. But in order to identify the signs, we need to be informed. We need to know about this, and that's the whole idea, that not everybody is working from a trauma-informed approach, and that I mean, but what I mean by saying that is that trauma-informed approach not only will help people to understand better their clients, but also to understand better their own responses to the work that they are, dealing with, the type of caseload, the type of issues that they are working with.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I understand that as part of your work as well, and the book you have heard that you have done, you have heard firsthand the stories of many workers. You mentioned that before, that they have been impacted by traumatic and stressful situations. Do you think in their stories, there are kind of common themes that run through? Apart from guilt, I think we are identifying guilt, no? But is there more, do you think?
Yeah, I think, I mean, what we're finding at the moment is people are really reaching out. They're really understanding the indirect exposure to trauma as well as the direct exposure. It's not just people on the front line. And, what we found through the pandemic, we've had tech companies reach out to us, which is quite unusual. It's not,
Yes.
So we turned our...
Not surprising, though.
Yeah, so we kind of have a strap line at the end of most of our communication about caring for the carers. We support those who care for others. And we've added protect the protectors as well, because now we're supporting these young people that are coming out from university with degrees in cybersecurity and terrorism, and they're trailing the internet, trying to make it a safer place for us. And obviously exposed to high levels of trauma material and often working from home. And there was a big case with Facebook, which, where staff sued for suffering PTSD from experience viewing traumatic material online. So I think organisations are reaching out more around the vicarious trauma than ever before. That's definitely something we're seeing. And the other thing is the longevity of trauma, like not just, I think, and the pandemic was an example of that, people living and working through trauma. So these aren't just big one-off events. How do we support people differently because they are living in the trauma? And so we've been doing a lot more kind of psychological first aid, peer support, training others in how to support people through the trauma whilst it's ongoing. As you say, we want to make as many people as possible trauma informed, so they have tools to recognise in themselves and to recognise in others when people are suffering, how we can stabilise, what resources we can put in place, and to normalise the response.
Yes.
So that's one of so there's the cumulative impact. There's also the delay. One of the things we really advise organisations is to watch out for that delayed response. We know that 30% of people have a delayed response to trauma. So it's really important to do that follow-up, check-in. If we ask someone directly after being exposed to trauma and they say they're fine, then ask them again in a few weeks' time and a few months' time. If 30% of people are suffering from delayed response, and we need to look at that. And also that organisations are highly stressed, I find. And I can really, you know, when we're invited in to support a new organisation, I can really feel the energy, how stressed that organisation is. But also from the terminology they use. Like what, you know, when we're hearing that kind of divisive language, that kind of them against us. So listening out for the terminology, how stressed is the organisation? Obviously, if an organisation is stressed, everyone's already on that kind of hyper alert anyway.
Yes.
And then obviously these organisations are very reactive. They're dealing with emergencies and crisis. And so can be much more reactive than responsive. So all of these can impact individuals working in that sector, and those are some of the themes that we've seen.
Yeah, you make me think about the classic firefighting attitude or way of working, that every day is a firefighting, you know, that persistently in that crisis mode for everybody in the teams. And that I have seen that a lot, especially when organizations are understaffed.
Yes.
And that's a very big problem as well within organizations, I think, that create this, the demand is so big, but the teams are not big enough, or the structure and the ways of working of the teams sometimes are not well coordinated enough, or so the operations aspect of services, it becomes quite important as well in facilitating the way that people will feel about their job as well. No, I was in a very interesting seminar the other day, and they were making the emphasis, a very strong emphasis about the fact that the issue around burnout is a job-related issue, and that makes so much sense to me.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and we found a lot of the NHS staff were reaching out to us, healthcare workers through the pandemic, you know, absolutely that overwhelm and lack of resource, and as you say, understaffed, but having to work through crisis.
Yeah, persistently, no? And there is also this other concept that I really find quite interesting, that is related to the fact that sometimes when we are working with very limited resources, and we know that much more can be done, or the level of service that can be provided could be better or higher or more done in a different way, it leaves as well the worker with this sense of almost with their moral compass completely touched and undermined, in the way that they know they can do better, they know this can be done differently, but the organizations are not also facilitating that. And we don't want to demonize organizations, but I think we are working in an environment where funding is difficult, especially for the charity organizations, and that we know that there has been understaffing everywhere, really, and the pandemic was also a big challenge for the NHS.
And I think that's why, you know, lots of people now are talking about the impact of moral injury, exactly for those reasons.
Yes. And according to your experience, Fiona, what can support resilience?
Well, I suppose, again, you know, as we both said, how do we make organisations trauma informed? It's so important to have the knowledge, have the understanding, have the confidence. We do a lot of management training, and what I find is that managers are generally confident in dealing with physical issues, but when it comes to mental health issues, they're very hands-off. And so we try to provide tools for managers to feel confident in dealing with that just as well, because when we're hands-off, we know that actually situations escalate rather than de-escalate. So really about embedding the preventative measures, And the pandemic showed a lot of that. You know, organisations were reaching out much more for the training, the stress management, trauma awareness, critical incidents response training. We've got some mental health awareness for managers training. But we want to keep that momentum going, because that was and is in a crisis. The other thing I find is, you know, yes, organisations have their duty of care policies, but they don't know them, you know, so and actually a lot of managers are promoted within an organisation and they're not given a lot of time or training or support in being a manager.
Yes.
And we do this 4-step management program, which is personal resilience, mental health awareness, conflict resolution and absence management. And each of those is tied into a policy within the organisation, and we ask the managers to read those policies before they come on the courses, and then we'll explore them. And even then, they haven't had the time to read those policies. So again, it's that kind of being reactive, isn't it? In the moment something happens, rather than doing the preventative work. So we know the policy inside and out, and know how to use it and how well it works and supports staff. And I do, I had a client the other day who said to me, my trauma is not a procurement process. And it really stood out to me. She really had to fight to get the support that she needed through her organisation. And I find this a lot with clients, that they're almost having to educate the organisation about trauma response. But these are people that are traumatized. I mean,
exactly. How can you do that?
Energy.
Yes.
So again, having the preventative measures in place, having the systems embedded. You know, we talk often about the 3 factors of resilience. So to be adaptable, to be able to be flexible. Things are changing all the time in this in these sectors.
Yes.
Being realistic, focusing on what we have control over rather than what we don't have control over, and then holding on to the meaning and very much about the passion of why we do the work we do. And we know with burnout, often that passion goes and we become much more cynical.
Completely goes away, and we lose sight about the purpose as well of why are we doing what we're doing, no?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, and we've had a lot of organisations reach out to us recently saying they want to put more of the preventative measures in place. So how do we become a resilient organisation?
Yes.
I mean, in the stress management workshops, there's a model that I've created on the respect to resilience model. So it's just taking more the research and into one simple model to remember, how do we respect ourselves? How do we prioritise our own self-care? So R is for ways of relaxing, E is the education, so it is becoming trauma informed, understanding the mechanics of stress, why we have the symptoms, the normalization. S is for social connection, now I've got to remember. P is for the physical, and E is exercise. C is creativity, because we know when we're doing creative activity, it's doing the opposite to the brain as what stress does.
Yes.
And then P is for the thinking, so challenging the thinking, because we have a lot of senior management, CEO level perfectionists who suffer from imposter syndrome. But we know when we're stressed, all of those negative thoughts come to the surface anyway. I'm not good enough, I'm not coping, I'm weak, I'm stupid, whatever it might be, I'm a failure. And so T is really looking out for those thinking patterns and challenging those. So it's quite a nice model that I bring in, and yes, it can develop an individual's well-being plan, but it can also be looked at from an organizational perspective as well.
Absolutely, because this is a problem that is not only an individual's problem, but is an organizational and needs to be looked at in that systemic way, no? And you make me think as well about one of the recent episodes. We were talking about the shadow of the manager and how important it is for managers as well to develop their own self-care strategies, but also work on their own self-awareness, for them to know and who and how are they operating in front of the issues that their organization is working with, but because that will tell a lot about how the team is, no, and how resilient the team can be. I love this idea of prevention. I think we always talk about prevention in this field, but I hear a lot, we don't have time. The idea that we don't have time. People don't have time to take a break. People don't have time to read a policy. They don't have time because we are all so focused on the issues and the problems that need resolving that very little is left for that preventative work. Yeah. And what from the model that you were explaining, what jump up for me is the word respect. The side of respect, no? I never thought about it in that way, actually. And if we want to think about respect to self, we need to be honoring as well who we are, why are we doing what we're doing, but also what are we feeling, you know, recognizing that we are human and that it's not on our hands to resolve the problem that we are facing and witnessing, but that we can be part of the solution.
Absolutely, yes.
And
yeah.
Probably in that way there can be boundaries to put there too, no?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just going to say on what you were saying earlier, that, you know, when we do that 4-step management program, we always start with personal resilience. And managers want to jump into the next step, but we have to role model, we have to practice what we preach, you know, and the biggest stress factor in organizations is the relationship you have with your manager.
Yes.
So it's so important. And some managers are really, you know, trying to embed wellbeing programs, but then if they're not role modeling it, we know stress is contagious. And as you say, top down, bottom up, we can feel that energy in an organization.
Absolutely.
We need to address it.
We do. And hopefully managers will be also stimulated, encouraged and motivated with the things that we are talking here in the podcast. There's so much support and possibilities. I think these open up. I think what we're talking about as well here about is not we are doom and gloomed kind of thing, but managers have an amazing opportunity to go ahead and start to think about what's going on in their organizations that will help the prevention of burnout, the increase of resilience, and the normalizing of those conversations as well, to say every now and again, you know, that event that we went through 3 months ago, I had a dream about it last night, for example, no? And normalize that, because that can happen. It's part of the process and how we process very, very difficult information. What do you think? I mean, in as you know, in the podcast, we always make a call for action. And so what are the first steps that managers could take to engage in that development of a trauma management program that we already started to talk about a little bit? But what do you think is, if we were to do a call for action, what that will be, do you think?
Yeah, I think, you know, I did a webinar recently on psychologically safe working environments. So we want to create a psychologically safe management style and working environment. And that's very much around, you know, obviously moving away from shame and blame. We learn from mistakes. We have an open environment where people can kind of bring those concerns forward and don't feel that they're going to be shut down.
Yes.
And creating pause moments, I think, is really important. And when we talk
creating about pause moments,
we look at Babette Rothschild, and she always says about putting the brakes on. So I try to do that in these organizations. Where can we find the pause moments? If you manage an hour's meeting, finish at 50 minutes, the same half an hour, finish at 20 minutes, give those pause moments. People come to my workshops and they literally leave as the moment it finishes. They're back to back in another meeting, and then another. You know, there has been a major incident. Do the prep work, get together, discuss what perhaps are going to be trigger warnings, what the concerns are, how we're going to look after each other through this intensive piece of work. And then afterwards do the wash up. What were the learning? Every single critical incident we're involved with and supporting organizations with, there's always learning that comes out of it. What are those learnings, and how can we really integrate them back into the organization so the same mistakes aren't made over and over again? Because that's something I often hear from people. I suppose the leading by example, yes. So really think about, how do we role model? What messages are we giving as a manager? How do we manage our stress? That it is toxic, it is contagious. And I said, watch out for that toxic terminology. You know, I remember when I was promoted to mid-manager in this organization, and I looked at my diary and I had 5 back-to-back meetings and there was no lunch break. And the CEO walked past my desk and I said, oh, look, I've got all these back-to-back meetings. And she said, welcome to my world. So really watch out for those kind of comments that are made they almost become part of the furniture of an organization.
Yes.
But they're not acceptable. And so how do we do that differently? What messages? It's like when someone goes to their manager, says, I'm stressed. And the manager says, yes, I'm stressed too. You know, that doesn't find the solution. Let's look at how we find those solutions. And the other thing I was advising is that through, particularly through the pandemic, but let's keep these conversations going. We want to normalize the language of mental health.
Yes.
If we're working in these sectors, we are going to be impacted. And so keep those conversations going. And when we do the team meetings, not always to be task orientated. So let's do a meeting where we're just talking about well-being, checking in with individuals, because of hybrid working as well. You know, what is their health situation? What challenges do they have? What are the stress factors? What are their preferences? You know, to really look at the individuals and what their needs are. So yes, and then I mean, to embed a trauma management program is a whole other. Do you want me to talk about what types of things that organizations should be looking at embedding? Or
I mean, if you want to give us one tip from where to get started, how organizations can get that very first step, because we know there are many angles that this can be looked at, and you also already mentioned lots of good ideas like the pause moment. Understanding the trigger signs is fundamental to understand your stressors, right? Learning, what do we do? Something that we talk a lot here as well in the podcast is what do we do in the after? You know, we prepare, we go through the work that needs to be done, but then what happens after? And that what happens after can be useful not only to learn from what can be done differently, but also to help us to process what happened and how we, on the one hand, how we respond, but also how it did affect us, no? And how that then influenced the kind of decisions that we are doing in that moment and so on. And you also mentioned the toxic terminology and how organizations can go into that place of let's find solutions more than just let's carry on. I think something that I come across a lot is that element of that sometimes meetings go into a moaning kind of tone, in which managers are also part of it, you know, and that creates like a spiral or a circle or a cycle that is doesn't have any, is not productive in any way, no? But what happens when we stop and say, okay, this is what is happening, and let's think about what could be a solution here.
Yeah, so to have those spaces and create the time, and as you say, maybe having the, managers will often have a kind of a practical debrief, but also a psychological debrief with a specialist, or listening circles. So we're really hearing and understanding underneath the moaning what's really going on, because there is clearly an issue that needs to be addressed and things need to be changed, and people are feeling unsatisfied. And so what are those points that we can pull out of that to find constructive solutions?
Yeah, and together, I think what we are talking about here as a thread of our conversation, what I am hearing is that we are talking about togetherness, that organizations and individuals can implement ways of, and that's very positive as well, that everybody can implement different activities and ways of practicing that will help them to maintain resilience. So in that way, it makes me think, well, we are not alone, no, and our organization can be part of the solution too, which is a very, very fantastic, good opportunity in this field, because we tend to be so aware of negativity and negative material, no, and painful material.
Yeah, and I think with trauma care, we want to be part of, we want to watch out for anyone who's becoming disconnected and isolated.
Yes.
And we want to feel connected, and, community care, how we come together is really important in that recovery.
Yes, absolutely. Is there, Fiona, anything else that you would like to share with us today? Do you think we have reached a good point to close? What do you think?
Yes, I mean, I could go on talking forever, so I think that's
Me
a good
too.
place to close for today. Absolutely.
Yeah, and definitely our paths will cross over again, Fiona. We can think about other episodes together as well. You are more than welcome in Mind Your Mind. So thank you so very much for today. And a reminder for all our audience that if you find this episode particularly useful for you, or probably for your manager at your organization, please share it. Help us to help and spread the word that working from a trauma-informed approach can be quite positive, not only for individuals, but also for organizations, and that we can work around this together. So thank you so very much, Fiona, once again, and thank you for listening. Bye.
Bye.